Hello, everybody. It's Paint Eater, and we're on War Thunder today because we're actually talking about the history of Hungarian tanks. Not armored cars, even though I do have a Saba. We're talking about tanks. So, interestingly enough, um, the Hungarians were lost World War One badly. So they had the Treaty of Trianon, which was basically you can't have tanks or anything. So they couldn't technically get any tanks. Oh, hold on. My audio's tweaking. We'll turn this down because it's going to be loud, and then there we go. That fixed it. So they would buy tanks under the idea of they were getting more for the police force. So in 1928, and of course the Hungarian army sent a number of delegations to the UK, Italy, and Sweden in search of a new tank design. First vehicles purchased were the three Harden Lloyd Mark VI tankettes from the UK, and from Italy, like 5 Fiats 3000 Bs were purchased. Which, if you don't know the Fiat, which I'll show images, because I'm just going to have Hungarian gameplay in the background as just kind of gameplay. Anyway, the Fiat 3000B is just the Italian version of the French FT-17. And 10 German LK2 tanks. Though by this point, most of those tanks, actually all of those tanks were obsolete. So they were morely used of training purposes to gain, experience. So to actually get better vehicles, Hungary sent a delegation to Italy for more modern vehicles, and since the Hungarians and Italians actually had a decent... Sorry, I'm doing two things at once. Shoot. Anyway, and since they had actually such a good, reliable, they were pretty good, and they had good military cooperation, and it led to the acquisition of numbers of military equipment, including a large amount of tanks and aircraft. And they actually got the CV-33 and 35 light tanks sent to Hungary, which is it's this variant, but make it worse and give it a machine gun. And also, some sources say that the Hungarians obtained a license for the production of these tanks in total, like all of these. There were 152. 152 of these little tanks were used in the Hungarian service. And the 35, they were known as the 35M for the CV-33 and the 37M for the CV-35, or just simply known as Ansaldo. And one flamethrowing version based on the Italian light tank was also required. And the Hungarians would change the machine gun type and used by this vehicle and add a command cupola on some of 45 of them. So I can actually show an image. So this tank's already bad enough. And this is only like, I think, a 1943-44 variant. But now it's worse because it's under Hungarians. And, well, these tanks are fast and they're good, I guess, with quotation marks. They were extremely outdated. So the Hungarians tried to find more modern types. One of them was the Swedish L-60 light tank in 1937. And after running a few test trials on it, in 1938, the Hungarians obtained a license for the production of the vehicle, which they end up making the Toldi tank, known as the... So, hold on. In the beginning, you're going to see... Okay. I'm going to point this out. The biggest difference between the Toldi 1 and the 2... Actually, I was going to cut this part, but I can just show you. Sweden. The difference, which it's this tank, right? No. This is the Toldi. The only real difference between the first 80 vehicles of the Toldi 1 that were made and the 110 Toldi 2s. I'm pretty sure. Nope. So first off, the Toldi 2 was this one was armed with the 20mm anti-tank gun and a machine gun. But this was all produced in like 1938. But in 1941, they ordered the Toldi 2, the 38M 42B20, for 110 vehicles. And the only difference between them is that, this tank was more of like used on German and Swedish parts, while the 38 M22 was used more domestically. And it was actually replaced with the 40 millimeter, which, do your research. I'll point out very obviously, they don't have any. So thanks, War Thunder, for not allowing me to use the Toddy. So anyway, getting back to the point, and not just trying to yap. The last modification, called the 38M Toddy 3C40, was made, but like only like less than 20 vehicles were produced during 1943. And there was a prototype of making a 7.5 centimeter anti-tank gun, often called the Toddy Panzerwaffe, which just means Toddy tank destroyer. And due to the lack of production, only one prototype of that vehicle was made. They also made an ambulance version called the Toddy EU-20. So that's cool, yes. But now we're going to talk about the tank I'm playing, the Turan. So, in 1937, a program was made in June of 1937 called the Huba 1 program. Basically, this was trying to increase Hungarian tank stuff and it wanted basically 2 motorized brigades equipped with 36 light tanks and 13 armored cars. However, Hungarian engineer Nicholas Strausser made the Saba, which is this one, made the first Hungarian tank, the V3, in 1933. And then he made an improved version of called the V4. The V4, which the source talks about, was rigged by a strong 20 millimeter strong armor and was armed with one 40 millimeter anti-tank gun. It was presented to the Hungarian army officials, but due to the constant requirement changes, like for example, swimming ability, it would not be adopted, and only one working prototype was ever built. And another big reason was also because the Toddy tanks. However, the Turan, oh yeah, the tank. Whoa! This is the tank I'm playing. The Turan. This has the side skirts. So the Turan. This was before the outbreak of the Second World War. Hungary was still looking for a better tank, and there it is, right there. The tank I was about to mention. The Panzer IV they wanted to make. Germany said no. They showed the Swedish Lago tank, but they also said no because it's delayed development. And the Italians also said the idea of the M1139, but it was obvious to even the Hungarians that tank was outdated. And as you can see from the tank in front of me, the M1340 was offered, which they would have liked more, but it was not available for the time. So something else needed to be done. So the Hungarians went to the Skoda factory. They made the PZ35Ts and the 38Ts used by Germany and a lot of other countries, and was formerly Czechoslovakian, now German, because of the Nazis. The Hungarians were able to, with basically Germany Sigma, we're cooked. I'm cooked. I'm dead. The Germans allowed them to use this to get a tank, and they chose the T-21 prototype as a basis for the new tank. Some changes were made. For example, the Hungarians actually made the turret bigger to hold 3 crews, 3 members. Which we're actually going to use the Saba, because we were just talking about the Chaba, or is it whatever it's called. And they also added a 260 horsepower domestically produced engine and a 40 millimeter gun, which from sources I've seen was nicknamed by the Hungarian crews as the pea shooter because it sucked. This little armored car I can talk about, but not now. So it was called the 40M Turan, which was based off inspired by the old prehistoric tribes of Hungary, and the production began in August of 1941. Being carried out by a bunch of Hungarian companies, but the production orders were changed several times due to the war demands, and by 1944, like 279 of the 41, the 40M Turon, not the Tori, the 40M Turon were built. This is important, and I'll show you why. Because it was the most modern Hungarian tank, but the 40mm was extremely, like, shit. So they needed to make a better tank. So what they decided to do was give it a short 75mm cannon, which is not the one you get in War Thunder, which is kind of weird. You'd think, if anything, you'd be gifted that over the 40mm. You'd think you'd be gifted all three, but, you know. Oh, okay. And it was really just a 75mm tank upgrade. It was only really ready in 1943. This was planned in 1941, so it took like 2 years to get this, and only around 180 were built by 1944. The last attempts, which is a tank you can get in War Thunder, actually. This is not. I'm not sponsored. I'd love to be sponsored, but I'm not. I can't be sponsored yet. Another thing was the Turon 3, which was a long 75mm cannon with like only one prototype being built due to problems with gun development. So it never really. This was a unique way, and you're gonna see the side armor. The Hungarians kind of adopted this from the Germans, and also it was used against anti-tank rifles from the Soviets. However, due to the basically not enough Turons and the actual work done by the Stug, because the Stug's a good tank, the Hungarian army decided to make basically a tank destroyer with the Turon chassis, which you have the 7.5cm anti-tank gun, the 44M Zereni 1, or a 10.5cm howitzer, the 43M Zereni 2, which is the one you can get, the Zereni 2. It just has 40/43, but it's just the 43. This is armed with a 105 howitzer. It was named after Nicholas Graf Zereni, famous for fighting against the Turks in the 16th century. And while the anti-tank version was not adopted for service, the assault version would be built in small numbers around 72 and would see extensive action against the Soviets, which is the tank you're seeing me play right now. So, yeah, pretty good. Good job, Hungary. No, that's not it, of course. They had a few German tanks, which I gotta talk about. They also had a proposal influenced by the German Martyrs to build a similar vehicle. For this purpose, the Turon chassis would be armed with an anti-tank gun. While 6 prototypes were to be built, there's no proof that this was ever implemented. So, yeah. This tank was more used as a Stug than the anti-tank version, because there's no. And then the final one is the TOS project, which you should be seeing on screen now, if the editor is correct, and the editor is me. This is basically the idea of a Hungarian Panther. To be armed with like a 75mm cannon. But they didn't have the industrial capacity to even make these, which you're gonna hear a lot. They don't have the industrial capacity to make a Hungarian tank, really. So only like 2 possible prototypes were built, depending on the source. And they were destroyed in Allied bombing raids against the Hungarian factories in 1944, and there was also a plan for a tank hunter version, supposedly armed with an 88. While often mentioned to be real, this is nothing more than false, because I'm in enemy territory. I'm trying to find somebody to kill. And like I said, while mentioned to be false, it was actually never intended to be built by the Hungarians. Or probably would be ever built by the Hungarians, especially by 1944 standards. There you go. Now, it talks about other stuff like, oh, some like stupid tractor tanks being used, but I don't care. Because those aren't actually tractor tanks. They're like, I don't know, they're armored carriers, is what I'm saying. Whoa, 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 what is going on behind me? Golly. So our first video was Italy, and now we have this. I think I did better. So Germany was actually unwilling with most of their minor Axis powers, like Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria, were unwilling to supply them with tanks. And oh yeah, the Croatians, not willing to supply them with German tanks. But Germany started getting its ass kicked by it started getting its ass kicked by the Soviets in 41, and they were lacking fighting men. So they would basically try to rely more on their allies, but the problem is their allies had really crappy weapons. So from 1942 to 19, they had a plan to basically rebuild the Balkan allies here. I forget exactly what it was called. I could probably put it on screen. But between 1942 and 1945, the Hungarians operated a number of different German vehicles. In 1942, they operated the two Panzer I Ops A, one acquired in 38 and the other acquired in 42, eight Panzer I Ops B with possibly some command vehicles based on the Panzer I, five Marder IIs, and possibly even more in 1944, 108 38T Panzers, 38Ts, 10 Panzer III Ops N, 22 Panzers Ops F1, and hold on, I'm trying to read, gang. Hold on, accurate battle of this. Oh, accurate battle. Yeah, those T-28s don't stand against a 105. What? He's being shot. Well, he's shooting, but there's no one there. Oh, I think we're just shooting because we won. Anyway, 10 Panzer IV Ops F2G, and they wouldn't get new vehicles. Actually, I can. In 1943, they wouldn't get new vehicles. The Germans, they had that's a cool tank. They were gifted the Panzer F2 and G, as you can see on screen as I'm showing off. The Marder. We can look at it. This is the Marder 3, not accurate. So my bad. And of course, stuff like this is the 38T I was talking about. The 35 right there. I don't have the Panzer II on, my bad. Panzer IIs and all that good stuff. But in 1944, that was the better part. I'm going to go on a little side rant. Hungary was probably, if not one of the best minor Axis powers. Not only willing to align with Germany early war, but also, if you're wondering, I do USA. But working with them in early war and like having the only country with actually a tank force, a domestic tank force, might I say, because a lot of the Romanians didn't really have. Romania had mad tanks, but they were really bad and just really cheap crap tanks. Bulgaria, I don't think even had tanks. And yeah, so the Hungarians were gifted over five. They were gifted the Panther Off G, which is this one. You know, this is the basic Panther when you think of Panthers. 10 Tigers, which some sources say like, oh well, it actually was gifted to them and they used them, but also some say like they were just gifted the command of them. Anyway, they had 10 of these Tigers, which this one's the Tigris, and 50 Stug 3 Offs G, which it's actually this one. I was right. And around 20 Panzer IV Offs H, possibly a few more Panthers, and 75 Jagdpanzer 38Ts were obtained. Now, might I remind you, there's no toadies, there's nothing in the focus, okay? You could have gifted us some. Unless I'm blind, there's no Hungarian. Is there even a Hungarian anti-tank? I would be surprised. There's this, but that's it. Oh yeah, I gotta talk about that. Nope. It is actually worth mentioning. We can talk about this earlier. The Hungarians did try to get a license for some German tanks, like how I said in the beginning, they tried to get a Panzer IV, but the Germans said no. But the situation changed by the war's end as the Germans offered the Hungarians the license to build Panzer IVs and Panthers, but they didn't. They kind of left it alone, which is really cool. And also French vehicles, they had 15 Hotchkiss 35s and H35s and H39s and two Samoa S-35 tanks. They were used in Ukraine against partisans and were lost fighting the Soviets in 1944. They also had some Soviet vehicles, I'm guessing during early. They had 4 to 6 BA-6 armored cars, 10 T-27 tankettes, 6 T-26s and BT-7s, which I'm not being lit up by one. I'm just being lit up by this dude. Maybe he's a fan of Paint Eater. Anyway. 4 M3 Stuarts because of the Lend-Lease. 1 T-28 and over 10 T-34 76 and 85 medium tanks. Which, would be a cool premium, but we don't have those. Remember, these are rough estimations of what they had. It's hard to find this kind of information about these tanks. And also, these vehicles were not really used on the front line due to lack of spare parts and ammunition. For example, the BA-6 armored cars were used as anti-partisan fighting. And after World War II, the Hungarian tanks in the Red Army, they had a few. Don't. I'm not a bad player. I'm just doing like 13 things at once. So, the Independent Tank Battalion of the Hungarian Red Army had 8 Tarans, 2 Todis, 3 Zurinis, and 2 Nimrods. I need to talk about the Nimrod. Don't worry. They would see some action up until the end of the war, and that's kind of most Hungarian tanks, or any like minor axis, because all of them were in the east. All of them just kind of got Soviet tanks. Surprisingly, a small number of Turan and Zurini SPGs, as in the one I'm playing, were abandoned near Bratislava in early 1945, and these were reused by the Czechs after the war testing, but they would be obsolete and just thrown out once actual tanks came in. So now it's time for the Nimrod. In 1938, the Hungarian military delegation again visited Sweden, and on this occasion, interest in the Landsverk L62, something you can get in the game. So that's just answers the question. You're fine with copy and paste tech trees. Why not just throw in a few more Hungarians? And, well, the Hungarians already kind of... It was armed with the 40mm Bofors gun, which, lucky for the Hungarians, they were already making and using that gun, and it shared a lot of the same parts with the Todi. So, it would be strategic. Oh, shoot. Is that a jet? No. I got a little scared. So, basically, they bought the L62 from the Swedish tech tree and made it. I'm dead. I'm dead. No! No! There's like a few changes, like the increase of the open top turret size and adding more ammunition. The initial order for 46 of those vehicles of the known as the 40M Nimrod was placed in 1940. Some 135 would eventually be built. While this could engage ground and air targets, the Hungarian army intended it to be used as an anti-tank gun. And also one was made into an ambulance. They also had an engineer vehicle. And they also, due to some sources, say that they were going to be used as an armored personnel carrier in some of them. But due to the lack of production capabilities, only one prototype of the auxiliary version was built. That's kind of the brief history of the Hungarian tank force of World War II. You're going to really notice that a lot of it's outdated, and by the time it could be useful, like those tanks, like the Turan, that might be their only good tank, but it was kind of built in 1941, which by that time, it would have been better, like, bring it in 1940, maybe. Better than Italy. As we can see, I'm playing an Italian tank. Trying to be accurate with my setup. But, of course, it ends up being like these Hungarian tanks, along with every other minor Axis powers, and even Italy. A lot of these tanks were made at the wrong time for the right purpose. Like, if Hungary would have gotten the Turan out by like 1938, even 39, the Hungarian tanks would be like the best because how do oh yeah, take that. Now, speaking of this being basically a pea shooter, the Hungarian tanks were apparently the cannon, the 40 millimeter cannon, was apparently nicknamed the um uh-oh, uh-oh, the pea shooter because of basically how weak it was. This dude probably thinks I'm actually trying to play this just for the fun of it, but I'm actually playing this to try to get a Hungarian tank gameplay. Get him, yeah. This is what basically they were fighting in World War II. This is what they had to use. Now imagine that against a T-34. So yeah, you're gonna come to realize Hungarian tanks are very bad. Like, would you want to fight a T-34 with this? Not so much. Speaking about fighting a tank that beats me. Okay, there was a bomb too. That was a little much. Look at that, straight through the component. So yeah, that was my tank talks. I plan on doing a little more. I'll try to get better research. Kind of. It's not really the research, it's more the tanks, and I guess the editing. So yeah, if you don't like and subscribe, you're gonna look like this tank. So like and subscribe, and Nicholas Worthley will be proud of you.